Hi, this is a simple screencast on the issue and debate of holism versus reductionism. I've tried to keep it nice and simple, nice and clear. Of course, you've got additional information in your textbook, and you've also got your booklet to help you as well. But hopefully, the idea behind this particular screencast is to A, make you aware of the differences between reductionism and holism, and also to hopefully show you how to use reductionism, holism correctly in issues and debates paragraphs throughout the psychology syllabus, as well as obviously in the issues and debates topic that you may find in an exam. So start off very, very quickly with definitions. So reductionism, clues in the name, reduction, reducing. What we're doing here is we're taking a psychological phenomenon and we're trying to understand it by reducing it down and down and down and down and down to very, very simple components. It's taking something quite complex and trying to understand the very, very key important aspects that may create that behavior or that phenomenon. Now, this is often seen as a useful tool because most people agree that taking or trying to understand something that's very complex and then reducing it and narrowing it down to simplistic ways of understanding that particular phenomenon, that's a good thing. It allows us to fully understand something by looking at the minuscule, minute areas within that phenomenon. Also, by doing that, it may also lead to things like therapies or treatments. And as a result of that, again, that would allow things to be seen to be, reductionism to be seen to be very useful. But note, you can actually also find reductionism is negative as well, because what we can sometimes do, and some would argue, we do this too often, is we actually break a phenomenon down into its small, simple components too much. And in doing so, we lose the full essence of that behavior or that phenomenon. So it's generally seen to be good to be able to break a very complex human behavior or psychological phenomenon down into small components so we can fully understand it. But in doing so, we may actually lose the full essence or the full behavior or the full meanings behind that behavior or phenomenon if we narrow our gaze too much. So what you could do with an issue and debate paragraph throughout the syllabus, if appropriate, is you could state that whatever it is you're studying could be seen to be reductionist and how that can be seen as a positive trait, but you can also suggest it may also be seen as a negative trait. So you don't necessarily need to say reductionism is good, you don't necessarily need to say reductionism is bad, because it could actually be a combination of the two. When you are using reductionism or understanding reductionism, we have these things called levels of explanation. And they are the levels that you can use to explain human behavior and a psychological phenomenon. So it's the same phenomenon or same behavior looked at in different ways, basically. And the reason this triangle is upside down with the narrow end at the bottom and the wider end at the top is the further down these levels we go. So these are the higher levels, these are the middle levels, and these are the lower levels. So the further we go down the lower levels, the more narrow our gaze becomes, the more focused we become, the more reductionist we become. Up here, less focus, less reductionist. Okay? At the top, you've got cultural, socio-political, and social cognition factors. Now, cultural will be obviously the culture you live in. Is it an industrialized individualist culture? Is it a collectivist culture? Your socio-political explanation or level of explanation might be, are you living in a democracy? Are you living in a communist country? Are you living in a country that's predominantly Christian? Are you living in a country that's predominantly Islamic? So you've also got religion in there. And then also you've got social cognitions, which is how you understand the world around you with regards to your upbringing and environment and culture and everything else around you. Your middle levels are then how you interact with other people, friends, family, colleagues, whatever it may be, and then your cognitions and emotions, i.e., how you feel about things, how you think about things, how you interpret things, how you understand things. The lower levels, which are all biological, genetics, physiology, and biochemistry, are all very, very specific. They're explaining behavior just on a biological understanding usually. So what we've got here is it your genes creating that behavior? Is it your biology creating that behavior? Is it your biochemistry, what's going on in your brain that's creating that behavior? So the further down this triangle we go, the more reductionist, the more focused we become. Here's an example. So on the left-hand side, you've got a father is attacking a man who's recently killed his daughter. At a higher level, we could understand this behavior from social cognition, where the father will understand that someone who's killed his daughter is evil. Now, that might be because he sees the act as a sin, because of the culture or the religion he's been in, because the culture he's been brought up in sees killing as something that needs to be punished. And as a result of that, he will see this person who killed his daughter as evil, deserves to suffer, and is therefore interpreting that particular behavior from his cultural, socio-political, religious point of view. He is therefore going to attack this man who's killed his daughter. If you then go to a middle level, historically, there may have been some form of interactions between the man who killed this person and the father. Perhaps there have been threats before. Perhaps the killer has suggested he may threaten to kill this man's daughter. Perhaps there's been arguments previously between them, in which case this is all to do with how we rub up against each other in life, how we interpret each other's behavior, how we get along with other people. And the reason the father may be attacking this particular man is because he's angry about what's happened in the past, the fact that threatening behavior has occurred, and as a result of that, he's now attacking this man who killed his daughter. At the level at the bottom, the lower level, the most reductionist of the lot, it could purely be a biological explanation. That the father may have got damage to his frontal lobes in his brain, and as a result of that, he cannot control his anger. He's enraged that his daughter's been killed, and instead of waiting for some form of legal process to deal with this and passing responsibility over to authorities, he cannot control his anger and rage because he's got frontal lobe damage, and as a result of that, he's attacked the man who killed his daughter. Now, this particular slide is one that I use if students don't fully understand when they can use reductionism as an issue in debate, paragraph, or evaluation, and when they can. A lot of students will use reductionism as an issue in debate or evaluation when they don't fully understand it. To be quite honest, if you don't fully understand reductionism, don't feel the need to use it. A lot of students feel the need to drop reductionism in every possible opportunity, but it may not be appropriate to do so. So obviously it'd be great if you could fully understand reductionism, because of course you could get a large question in the issue and debate section of the exam, but also you could use it when appropriate as an issue and debate evaluation paragraph in large questions throughout the syllabus. So it'd be great if you can fully understand it, but don't feel the need you've always got to use it. Okay, a lot of students feel you've got to get reductionism in, you've got to get reductionism. You don't. But if you are going to use it, make sure you use it correctly. And my little simple golden rule for using reductionism is if the approach being used that you need to evaluate begins with the letter B, you can use reductionism. So as mentioned before, obviously any biological approach, this is reductionist because we're reducing the phenomenon down to biological processes, to what's going on in your body. An example I've got there is if mental illnesses are a result of abnormal neurotransmitters in your brain, such as dopamine, then it could be seen to be reductionist. And remember, that could be good and it could be bad. The other one you should use is environmental reductionism. And someone always says, but environmental doesn't begin with B. Correct. However, any understanding of human behavior that suggests environment is the cause of that behavior, that is a behaviorist approach. And behaviorism begins with B. Careful, because behaviorism obviously includes operant conditioning, classical conditioning, and social learning theory, and none of those begin with B. But essentially, if we're suggesting that a human behavior or phenomenon is the result of environmental factors, that is a behaviorist approach and begins with B. The example I've given here is that love is nothing more than a behavior that responds to affection, reward, comfort, food from another. If you're going to break love, the emotion of love, or the physical manifestations of love, whatever it may be, the physical illustrations of love, into the stimulus and response. So the response is, I love you, and the stimulus is only because I'm getting affection or reward from you. Then again, we've reduced that very complex behavior of love down to a very simple understanding. Okay, it's been reductionist down to stimulus and response, and therefore we can use reductionism again. Now, you'll also find there is a third form of reductionism, which is experimental reductionism, which is where we try to fully understand the behavior by breaking, by understanding the behavior using experiments. And experiments break things down into IV affects DV. Now, the reason you can still use the two B's on this is because both the biological approach and the behaviorist approach tend to use experiments. And therefore, they are also using experimental reductionism within them to understand that human behavior. But generally, I say if it begins with a B, you can use reductionism. If it's psychodynamic, don't use reductionism. If it's humanistic, don't use reductionism. Okay, just stick to those two, and you should therefore be using reductionist in the correct way. Now, the second aspect of this, where students sometimes completely misunderstand how to use reductionism, is the difference between reductionist and limited. And a lot of the time, students will tell the examiner or tell their teacher that a particular theory is reductionist, when in fact they mean the word limited. So you need to know the difference between reductionist and limited. Okay, both, incidentally, are perfectly acceptable evaluations. You just got to know which one's which and when to use it. So let's deal with the reductionist one first, which is the easy one, the one on the left-hand side. And I'm using aggression as an example. So human aggression can be explained by having high levels of the hormone testosterone. So the reason people are aggressive is because they've got loads of testosterone pumping around their body. That is biological. It's a biological explanation. Okay? Therefore, because it begins with B, we can use reductionism. So what you could then state is this can be seen as reductionist because obviously it breaks the understanding of human aggression down into small parts, this case testosterone, but also it's ignoring other explanations which are also biological. For example, other hormones, neurotransmitters, structures of the brain. So we can argue that something is reductionist not only because it's narrowed something down into a small explanation, testosterone, but also because it's ignoring all the other possible explanations within that approach. All the other biological explanations have been ignored. So there's lots of other hormones, there's lots of neurotransmitters, there's lots of structures of the brain that could explain human aggression. So it's reductionist because we've broken something down, which is quite complex, such as aggression, into small components, but we've also ignored all the other small components that are also biological. Therefore, it's good and bad reductionism. On the other hand, however, we've got this concept of limited, which is where we say human aggression can be explained by the biological approach. For example, high levels of testosterone can explain aggression. So it's the same point. Now, we can use reductionism because it begins with a B, like we did on the left-hand side of this screen. But we can also, if we want, suggest this particular approach is limited. And this is where we go outside of that approach. So you can argue that explaining human aggression is limited if we're just trying to explain it via testosterone, because we're ignoring all the other possible approaches. For example, There might also be environmental explanations for why someone might be aggressive. That's behaviorist. Or maybe someone's been aggressive because they're responding to unconscious drives that they're unaware of, in which case that's psychodynamic approaches. And this is where we've moved out of the same approach. So if we stay within the same approach on the left-hand side, it's reductionist. If you're going to argue that something is ignoring other approaches, then it's limited. And they're both valid evaluations. Just make sure you're using the right one. Now, what students often will do is they'll say that the psychodynamic approach is reductionist. Number one, not right, because it doesn't begin with a B. And they'll say the reason it's reductionist is because it ignores things like biological explanations or behaviorist explanations. You don't mean reductionist, you mean limited. It's because it's ignoring all the other possible approaches. You can use limited for any approach, but you can only use reductionist when it's appropriate if it is a reductionist theory. So, the other side of the coin here, the other side of reductionism, is complete opposite. Again, clues in the name, holism. Instead of reducing human behavior into small, simple components, let's see everyone as the whole. Instead of looking at the small parts, let's add all the parts up together and see what we get. So instead of focusing on small, simplistic, minuscule explanations for that behavior, let's stand back. Let's see everything we possibly can to fully understand what's going on. Here's an example. We've got some Gestalt illusions, which I'll come back to on another slide. But this is what a reductionist would do. A reductionist would try and understand what's going on by breaking things down into small components. So these are just black lines, either black circles or black dots or black straight lines or black lines with angles or whatever it may be. And that is how a reductionist will try to understand that image. What a holist would do is stand back, try to piece them all together to get this. And when you get that, you then understand what we're really looking at. Because only by standing back will we actually see that these all add up to being a bicycle. So on the left-hand side, you've got reductionist, which is seen as perfectly acceptable for understanding complex phenomena. But holists would say, okay, fair enough, but you don't really get the full picture. You've got to stand back and put it all together. Looking at small components won't get you this. Here's another famous example of what we're talking about here. A reductionist perhaps will look at this image and say, this is nothing more than a two-dimensional image using charcoal or graphite or pencil on paper to produce some black and white or grey lines. They focused in specifically on perhaps the minuscule elements of what's going on there. A holist would stand back and they'd stand back and they'd stand back and try to work out what the whole sum of those lines mean. And if you look very, very carefully, and if you keep staring at it, you will actually see two ladies' faces in that particular image. And you can swap between the two. And Gestalt often, the Gestalt school of psychology often used visual illusions and looked at perception to try and illustrate this point that only by standing back do you fully comprehend what's going on in this particular image. If you focus specifically on a line or you focus specifically on a charcoal mark or whatever it may be, you're not going to get the full story of what's going on. Another example I'd like to give is of this gentleman here on the right-hand side called Kim Peek. You may or may not in your course have come across Kim. He's an amazing person who had this encyclopedic memory. He knew so many different facts. He was like a human Google. He could remember dates of things. He could remember birthdays. He was an amazing memory man, if you like. But he struggled throughout his life because of various aspects of brain damage he was born with. And there's lots of YouTube clips if you want to watch Kim, and he is a phenomenal character. And if you look at Kim and try and understand Kim, you could take a reductionist point of view because Kim has a very, very strange brain structure. And his brain structure is that the left and right hemispheres of his brain aren't connected. He has no corpus callosum. And because of that, the brain, using plasticity, has created neural pathways which allows him to remember things that you and I can't. And it's only because of that brain structure, that brain abnormality, that he can do these phenomenal feats of memory. That's reductionist. I've gone biological there. I'm saying that's it. That explains why he can do what he can do, because he's got no corpus callosum. We've narrowed it down to one aspect of his brain. However, you can stand back and look at this at a holistic point of view. Maybe, perhaps, Kim can do what he wants because he was brought up in Utah in America, where he had the ability to go to a library every day and digest lots of books. Maybe Kim can do what he wants because he had phenomenal loving care from his father all through his life, dealing with the most simple of needs that he couldn't possibly do. Maybe Kim can do what he wants because he actually met someone called Barry Morrow, who wrote a film screenplay about him, which became Rain Man, and won 5 Oscars. Maybe Kim is more than just his corpus callosum. Maybe there's more going on there. Because also, when you start to understand Kim, he can do loads and loads and loads of phenomenal memory techniques and tasks, but some things he can't do. So he can't problem solve very well. And also, he struggles to interact with people in certain ways. And as a result, if we really fully want to understand Kim, maybe we should take a holistic point of view. Maybe we should stand back and try and understand all the elements that's going on in Kim's life, as opposed just to his brain structure. If you prefer to take a reductionist point of view, then the chances are you're just going to try and explain his behavior just by his brain damage that he experienced at birth. So 3 examples of holism. As I've mentioned Gestalt before, it tends to be used with optical illusions and perception. It's the idea of we can only really fully understand something and perceive things correctly if we stand back and we see the whole image for what it is. If we just focus in like a reductionist would, you're going to miss it. Humanistic psychology, so anything in here, when you're using humanistic psychology, this would be seen to be an example of a whole. Humanistic psychology emphasizes the idea of a whole person, a unified identity, everything about the person adding up to what that person is. And without that full understanding of ourselves, without ability to strive for self-actualization, then we could struggle with all kinds of with problems in our life, such as mental illness. So to fully understand someone from a humanistic point of view, you're going to take a holistic point of view. And then also cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology in particular, say memory, will use models to try and understand how our memories work. A good example would be the multi-store model. So if you look at the multi-store model, we've got sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory, and they're kind of separate stores that kind of link together. But really, a more holistic approach to this, to fully understand human memory, will be to look at all the other forms of memory and how they interact. So, for example, what about semantic memories, procedural memories, episodic memories, the working memory model, different explanations of forgetting, etc. All of this, by just using linear models in cognitive psychology, perhaps we should be more holistic in an attempt to try and fully understand memory by trying to say, okay, that's one element of memory, I get that, but how will all the other memories link? How do you understand these things? How do you remember these things? How do you forget these things? And maybe a holistic point of view is a better understanding of our memory system. Some simple evaluations. On the right-hand side, which is supports the reductionist point of view, which is if we believe that science and a scientific approach is the best way to fully understand human behavior, you're going to have to start narrowing things down. We're going to have to get things down to IVs affecting DVs and making sure there are no confounding variables and making sure it's controlled environments, etc. And we're going to have to get very, very scientific. And if we're going to get that scientific, you can't take a holistic approach because there's too many variables playing around with everything else. So if we're going to suggest that psychology should take a scientific approach to studying human behavior and psychological phenomena, then essentially we should be looking at a reductionist point of view, because only then can we truly use scientific methods. Secondly, There's no doubt in it. There are lots of drugs therapies, and those drug therapies have obviously been created via trials through controlled experiments. And as a result of that, that was again a scientific approach, and it's been done in a reductionist point of view. Now, if we took a holistic approach, would we really have created the therapies and drug therapies that we now use to treat people for a variety of mental illnesses? If we were constantly looking at lots and lots and lots of explanations, maybe we wouldn't have narrowed down certain treatments or therapies that are now seen to be quite effective. Back to the idea of reductionism being seen as a negative point of view. If you're going to argue that we're breaking someone as complex as Kim Peek down to just his corpus callosum, are we truly understanding that behaviour? Do you really want to try and understand the human emotion of love by just stimulus and response? Do we really want to understand something as complex as, say, aggression or mental illness purely on the basis of biology only? So do we lose something about the individual if we just take a reductionist point of view? And then finally, sitting in the middle, we've got this dualist or interactionist point of view, which believes that the mind and the body are interacting. The body, of course, being biological and scientific, whereas the mind is more holistic, really. And what you tend to find is that maybe we've got an interaction between body and mind, and we shouldn't be taking a reductionist or holistic point of view, but accepting the fact that there's going to be some kind of middle ground between the two. For example, psychotherapy given to the depressed patients, so that's no drugs involved in psychotherapy, would affect serotonin and noradrenaline in their brains, and therefore that will actually produce the same kind of effects or similar effects as perhaps taking an antidepressant or any form of other drug treatments for mental illness. So we've got to understand the idea that there's going to be some form of interaction between mind and body, and therefore purely being reductionist or purely being holistic may not be particularly useful. So finally, what do you do with it? Obviously, if you still need further clarification, I'd like to read and highlight the sections in your textbook on reductionism and holism. Of course, you should also have done your issues and debates booklet pages that relate to reductionism and holism, and there are some can you questions to do on page 51 of the textbook. Be aware you could get a question in the issues and debates section on reductionism and holism, and you can also, if appropriate, use evaluative issues and debates paragraphs using holism or reductionism throughout the syllabus. And because of that, number 4 would be a useful exercise to do. Perhaps you should write 2 paragraphs, one on biological and the other on environmental reductionism, making sure you correctly top and tail those paragraphs. And you should apply them to something within the syllabus. Perhaps you might want to look at the theories, biological or behavioural, for explaining aggression, or possibly in the psychopathology topics as well. So there's biological explanations and also behavioural explanations in psychopathology. So it's behavioural explanations of phobias, so you might want to do that, and it's biological explanations of OCD. Hope it was of use. Cheers. Catch you later.